David Park opened his eyes to fire and smoked. The transport shuttle Meridian had been torn apart like paper, and pieces of metal and wire hung from what was left of the ceiling above him. He could hear the wind screaming outside and feel the cold already creeping through the gaps in the destroyed hull. He tried to move and pain shot through his left side, but nothing felt broken. He pushed himself up slowly, using a bent piece of the wall for support. His breath came out in white clouds. The temperature was dropping fast. The shuttle had been carrying 12 people on a simple diplomatic mission to a neutral station at the edge of known space. David was just a private first class assigned to security duty. It was supposed to be easy work. A few days of standing around looking professional, and then back home now. He stood in the wreckage of what used to be the passenger cabin, and he could not see anyone else. David called out, but only the wind answered. He called again, louder this time. His voice echoed off the twisted metal and disappeared into the frozen wasteland outside. Still nothing. He checked his suit, and his heart sank. The heating element was damaged and flickering on and off. His emergency beacon showed a cracked screen with no signal. His communicator was completely dead. The only thing still working was his visor display, and even that had a crack running down the middle. The display showed him what he already knew from the cold biting at his fingers. The display showed him what he already knew from the cold biting at his fingers. Temperature outside was -60 degrees and falling. It would reach -100 before the night was over. David had maybe 2 hours before his suit failed completely. After that, he would have maybe 20 minutes before the cold killed him. He searched the wreckage for supplies and found an emergency blanket still sealed in its pack. He found a small flashlight that still worked. He found half a ration bar that had been crushed but was still edible. He did not find any other survivors. Through a hole in the hull, he could see the landscape outside. The moon they had crashed on was called Kestrel 7. It was a frozen ball of ice and rock that the Galactic Survey Corps had marked as uninhabitable decades ago. No colonies, no outposts, no rescue stations. Nothing but endless white stretching to the horizon. David knew he should stay with the wreckage. That was basic survival training. The ship was shelter, and rescue teams would look for the ship first. But his suit was dying, and the wreckage offered no real protection from the cold that was coming. He would freeze to death before anyone found him. He checked his visor display one more time and saw something, a faint heat signature 3 kilometers to the north. It was weak, and it might be nothing, but it was the only hope he had. David made his choice. He wrapped the emergency blanket around his shoulders, grabbed the flashlight, and climbed out of the broken shuttle into the frozen hell of Kestrel 7. The wind hit him like a hammer. It cut through his damaged suit, like the suit was not even there. His fingers went numb in seconds, and his face burned from the cold. He put his head down and started walking north. The ground was uneven ice covered with a thin layer of snow that crunched under his boots. Every step was a struggle against the wind that tried to push him back or knock him down. He fell twice in the first kilometer, and each time it was harder to get back up. David thought about the others on the shuttle. Lieutenant Grace Kim had been his commanding officer. She was tough and smart, and if anyone could survive a crash like this, it would be her. Brian Lee and Rachel Cho had been sitting near the back of the passenger cabin. Maybe that section had stayed intact. Maybe they were out there somewhere trying to survive just like him. Or maybe he was the only one left. The thought made him want to stop and lie down in the snow. It would be so easy. Just close his eyes and let the cold take him. He was so tired already, and he had only been walking for an hour, but David kept moving. He did not know why exactly. He just knew that stopping meant dying, and something deep inside him refused to accept that his body was screaming at him to give up, but some stubborn part of his mind kept pushing him forward. One more step, one more breath, one more heartbeat. Each signature on his visor grew closer, but his suit was failing faster now. The heating element had stopped working entirely, and He could feel the cold settling into his bones. His fingers were completely numb, and his feet felt like blocks of ice. He could not feel his face any more. 2 kilometers down, 1 to go. The sky above him was strange and beautiful in a terrible way. 2 moons hung in the darkness, casting pale blue light across the ice field. Stars filled the gaps between them, more stars than David had ever seen. The galaxy stretched overhead like a river of light. David thought it was a good sky to die under. If he had to die, but he was not dead yet. He reached the heat signature as his legs finally gave out. It was a rocky outcropping jutting up from the ice with a shallow depression at its base that offered some shelter from the wind. The heat he had detected was coming from somewhere deep underground, maybe volcanic activity or maybe something else. He did not care. He only cared that the ground here was slightly warmer than the frozen wasteland around it. David crawled into the depression and pulled the emergency blanket tight around his body. The wind still found him, but it was weaker here. The cold was still killing him, but it was killing him slower. He knew this was not enough. The blanket was thin, and his suit was dead. He had no fire and no real shelter. He was lying exposed on an alien moon with nothing but his own body heat to keep him alive. It would not be enough to save him. David closed his eyes anyway. He was too tired to stay awake and too stubborn to admit he was dying. He told himself he would just rest for a minute. Then he would figure something out. He would find a way to survive, because that was what humans did. They survived. They always survived. His breathing slowed. His heartbeat grew faint. The cold wrapped around him like a blanket of its own, pulling him down into darkness. David Park slept. He did not see the figures emerging from the ice ridges around him, dozens of them rising up from hidden places in the frozen ground. They moved in silence there, crystalline bodies reflecting the pale moonlight like living mirrors. They surrounded the sleeping human in a wide circle, and they watched. They had been watching since his ship fell from the sky. They had seen him crawl from the wreckage when he should have stayed. They had seen him walk through killing cold when he should have died. They had seen him refuse to stop when any sane creature would have given up. Now, they watched him sleep in conditions that would kill any species they had ever encountered, and they watched something impossible happen. The human did not die. His heart kept beating. His lungs kept breathing. His body temperature held steady, even as the air around him dropped to temperatures that would freeze blood solid in seconds. The largest of the watchers moved closer and knelt in the snow beside the sleeping human. It studied him with eyes that glowed faint blue in the darkness. It had lived for 300 years, and it had never seen anything like this. The others followed its lead. One by one, they knelt around the human, forming a circle of silent guardians in the frozen night. They stayed that way until dawn, and when the sun finally rose over Kestrel 7 and David Park opened his eyes, he found himself surrounded by aliens who looked at him like he was something holy, something impossible, something they had been waiting for. Grace Kim woke to the sound of Brian Lee shouting her name, opened her eyes, and saw twisted metal above her. The rear section of the shuttle had broken away from the main body during the crash and had come to rest against a ridge of ice, a kilometer from where the front section had burned. Grace was alive, and that surprised her. Pushed herself up and checked her body. Nothing broken, a few cuts and bruises, but nothing serious. Her suit was intact and her heating element was working. She could feel its warmth fighting against the cold that pressed in from all sides. Brian was kneeling beside Rachel Cho, who was lying on her back with her eyes closed. Grace felt her stomach drop, but then Rachel coughed and opened her eyes, and Grace let out a breath. She did not know she had been holding 3 survivors out of 12. It was not good, but it was something. Grace took command because that was what she did. She had been a lieutenant for 6 years, and she had led people through worse situations than this. At least she told herself that. She organized a search of their section of wreckage. They found 2 working communicators with limited range. They found emergency supplies, including blankets and ration packs and a medical kit. They found 3 sidearms with full charge packs. Brian had been carrying them for the security detail. They did not find anyone else alive. Grace tried to raise the main wreckage on the communicator, but got only static. The crash had scattered debris across kilometers of frozen ground. The front section, where most of the passengers had been sitting, was too far away to reach with their short-range equipment. But they could reach it on foot. Grace made the decision to move at first light. The temperature was too dangerous for travel at night, and they needed to rest and recover from the crash. They would search for survivors in the morning. None of them slept well. The wind howled outside their shelter, and the cold crept in through every gap in the broken hull. Rachel kept checking her medical kit and organizing supplies over and over. Brian sat by the largest hole in the wall and watched the darkness outside like he expected something to come through it. Grace lay on her back and stared at the ceiling and thought about David Park. He was young, and he was new to her unit, but she had liked him from the start. He worked hard, and he did not complain, and he had a stubborn streak that reminded her of herself when she was his age. She hoped he was still alive out there somewhere. At dawn they moved. The sun rose pale and weak over Kestrel, 7 casting long shadows across the ice field. Grace led the way with her visor display, showing the direction of the main wreckage. Brian walked behind her with his sidearm ready. Rachel brought up the rear, carrying the medical kit. They found David's trail halfway to the wreckage boot, prints in the snow leading away from the crash site, and heading north. Grace felt a surge of hope. He had survived the crash, and he had been strong enough to walk. That was good. That was very good. But the trail led away from the wreckage, not toward it. Grace followed the prints with her team. David had been walking into the wind. His steps had grown shorter and more uneven as he went. She could see where he had fallen twice, and she could see where he had gotten back up each time. She could also see that he had been heading toward nothing. The heat signature he must have been following was faint and far away. There was no shelter in that direction, no supplies, no help, just ice and cold and death. Trail ended at a rocky outcropping 3 kilometers from the crash site. Grace saw the depression in the ice where David had taken shelter, and she prepared herself for what she would find: a frozen body curled up in a thin emergency blanket, eyes closed forever, skin blue and hard. That was what she expected. That was not what she found. David was sitting upright in the snow with his back against the rock. His eyes were open, and he was breathing. Steam rose from the ground around him in a perfect circle, like the ice itself had melted during the night. His skin was pale but not blue. His body was cold but not frozen. He was alive. Grace stopped walking so suddenly that Brian walked into her back. She could not move. She could not speak. She could only stare at the impossible thing in front of her. And then she saw the others. They surrounded David in a wide circle, standing motionless on the ice. They were tall and thin, with bodies that looked like they were made of crystal or ice. Their limbs were long and jointed in ways that should not work, and their eyes glowed faint blue in the morning light. Grace counted 40 of them, at least, maybe more. There could be others hiding behind the ice ridges or buried in the snow. She had never seen anything like them. The Galactic Survey had records of every known species in this sector, and nothing matched what she was looking at. These creatures did not exist, except they did exist, and they were standing in a circle around David Park, and they were not attacking. They were kneeling. Every single one of them had dropped to one knee in the snow, with their heads bowed toward David, like he was something sacred, something worthy of worship. Brian raised his sidearm, but Grace pushed his arm down slowly. She did not understand what was happening, but she understood that violence would only make it worse. Rachel moved forward carefully. Her medical training pushed her past her fear. She needed to check on David. She needed to make sure he was okay. The creatures did not stop her. They parted to let her through, and they watched her with those glowing blue eyes, but they made no move to hurt her. Rachel knelt beside David and checked his vital signs. Her hands were shaking, and her voice was unsteady when she spoke. "Is fine," she said. "His temperature is normal. His heart rate is normal. Everything is normal, but it's not possible." Brian said. "He was out here all night with a broken suit. The cold should have killed him hours ago, but it did not," Grace said. She stepped forward into the circle, and the creatures let her pass, too. She stood over David and looked down at the soldier who should have died. David looked up at her, and he seemed just as confused as she felt lightened. He said, "I do not know what is happening." "Neither do I," Grace admitted. "But I think they do." She looked at the largest of the creatures, standing at the edge of the circle. It was watching her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. But there was no hostility in its gaze, only curiosity and something else. Something that looked like hope. The creature raised one long limb and pointed at David. Then it spoke a single word in a voice that sounded like cracking ice. The word meant nothing to Grace. It was just noise, just alien sounds strung together in a pattern she could not understand. But David flinched like he had been struck. He understood it somehow. The word had meaning for him, even though he had never heard this language before. He did not know how he understood, but the meaning burned in his mind, clear and sharp and impossible to ignore. "What did it say?" Rachel asked. David looked at her, and then at Grace, and then at the dozens of alien creatures kneeling in the snow around him. "It called me Endurer," he said. The creatures called themselves the Velith. David learned this over the next several hours, through a strange combination of gestures and drawings in the snow and half-formed images that appeared in his mind like waking dreams. He did not understand how the mental connection worked, but it was there, a bridge between his thoughts and theirs. The Velith were supposed to be extinct. The Galactic Survey had declared them dead 200 years ago, when the first expedition to Kestrel 7 found only empty ruins and frozen bodies. They had catalogued the species and marked the file closed and moved on to other worlds. But the Velith had not died. They had hidden the largest of the creatures was called Elder, and it was the one who communicated with David the most. It showed him memories that were not his own, images of a world that had once been warmer and greener and full of life. Images of ships coming down from the sky with weapons that burned and machines that ate the earth. The Dominion. David recognized the name. Every human in the galaxy knew about the Dominion. They were an empire that stretched across 100 star systems built on conquest and slavery and the bones of species they had crushed beneath their boots. Humanity had fought them twice and won both times, but the wars had been costly. The Dominion had come to Kestrel 7 3 centuries ago. They had wanted the minerals buried deep beneath the ice, and they had not cared about the people who lived above them. They had burned the Velith cities and killed anyone who resisted and put the survivors to work in the mines. When the mines were exhausted, they left a small garrison state behind to maintain the automated equipment that still extracted resources from the southern hemisphere. But the Dominion had mostly forgotten about this frozen moon. The Velith had used that for getting to survive. They had retreated underground into caverns carved from the ice where the Dominion sensors could not find them. They had hidden their children and their elders and their hope, and they had waited. They were still waiting when the first alien survey ships came decades later. The Velith had watched from hiding. They had seen creatures that looked different from the Dominion, but they could not be sure. They could not risk revealing themselves only to be conquered again, so they stayed hidden and they watched. They watched the surveyors declare their world uninhabitable. They watched the ships leave. They watched more years pass with no one coming to help them and no way to free themselves from the Dominion garrison that still occupied their home. And then David's ship fell from the sky. The Velith had seen it come down in flames. They had expected to find more conquerors, more enemies, more death. Instead, they found a human. They found David. Elder showed David what they had seen. A creature walking through killing cold without protection. A creature falling and getting back up again and again. A creature refusing to die when death was the only logical outcome. The Velith had prophecies, ancient stories passed down through generations, about beings called Enders, who would come from beyond the stars to help them reclaim their world. These Enderers were described as carrying fire in their blood, as being unable to be broken by cold or hunger or despair. David had walked through cold that would kill any species the Velith had ever encountered. He had survived a night exposed to temperatures that should have frozen him solid in minutes. To the Velith, he was not just a survivor. He was proof that the prophecies were real. David tried to explain that he was just a human, that his species had evolved on a world with harsh winters and had spread across dozens of planets with different climates. Humans were adaptable. That was all, but Elder did not seem convinced. It showed David more memories. The Dominion soldiers who still occupied the southern mines. They were a species called the Korath, with thick armored skin and bodies built for heat. When the temperature dropped below freezing, they retreated to heated shelters. When it dropped further, they could not function at all. The Velith had tried to fight them once. 300 of their warriors had attacked a Dominion patrol in the deep cold, hoping that the temperature would give them an immense advantage. The Korath had simply called for reinforcements from the heated compound. They had waited inside until support arrived, and then they had slaughtered the Velith attackers. The cold that the Velith had hoped would be their weapon had meant nothing, but a human elder suggested. A human could fight in the cold. A human could survive where the Korath could not. A human could help them win. David felt the weight of that hope pressing down on him. It was too much. He was just one soldier with a broken suit and no backup. He could not liberate a planet. He could not defeat a Dominion garrison. He could barely keep himself alive. He told Elder this, and the creature simply pointed at the ground where David had slept. The ice had melted in a circle around him during the night. His body heat alone had raised the temperature enough to turn solid ice into water. That heat had kept him alive when he should have died. "You carry fire," Elder said in that strange half-mental voice. "You do not know your own strength." Grace had been listening to as much of this exchange as she could follow. She stepped forward now and put her hand on David's shoulder. "What exactly are you asking us to do?" she said to Elder. The creature turned its glowing blue eyes toward her, and David felt the images flow through his mind again. He translated as best he could. "They want us to help them fight." David said, "The Dominion garrison is small, maybe 50 soldiers. They have been here so long they have grown careless. The Velith have thousands of warriors hidden in the ice caves, but they do not know how to fight effectively. They have never won against Dominion forces, and they think we can teach them," Brian said from behind them. He sounded skeptical. 4 humans against 50 Dominion soldiers with alien backup that has never won a fight. Those are not good odds. The Velith have the numbers, David said, and they have the cold. The Korath cannot function in extreme temperatures, but humans can. If we can teach the Velith to fight the way humans fight, what way is that? Rachel asked. David thought about human history, all the wars and struggles, and desperate last stands. He thought about soldiers who had held positions they should have lost, and armies that had won battles they should have never survived. He thought about the stubborn refusal to quit that seemed to be coded into human genes. "We teach them to be too stubborn to lose," he said. Grace was quiet for a long moment. She looked at the Velith warriors kneeling in the snow around them. She looked at Elder with its ancient eyes and desperate hope. She looked at her team, 3 soldiers and 1 medic stranded on an alien moon with no backup coming. "This is not our mission," she said finally. "We are supposed to be diplomats, not liberators." David nodded. "That is true." Grace looked at him. "Do you want to do this?" David thought about the choice he had made the night before when he could have stayed in the wreckage and died. He thought about the stubborn part of himself that had refused to stop walking, even when his body was failing. "Yes," he said. "I do." "Then we need a plan," Grace said. She turned to Elder and spoke clearly and slowly. "We will help you, but we do this our way. Do you understand? Elder bowed its head in acceptance. Across the frozen wasteland hidden in their ice caves, thousands of Velith began to gather. They had heard through their ancient communication network that the Endurers had come. They had heard that hope had finally arrived. They were ready to fight. They just needed someone to show them how. Grace pulled David aside on the third day of training. They had set up a command post in one of the larger ice caves where thousands of Velith warriors had gathered. The cavern stretched for kilometers underground, lit by bioluminescent crystals that the Velith had cultivated for generations. The light was pale blue and cold, but it was enough to see by. "We need to talk, Grace," said David. Followed her away from the main group to a smaller tunnel where they could speak privately. He knew what was coming. He had been expecting this conversation since they agreed to help. "This is insane," Grace said. Her voice was calm, but David could see the tension in her shoulders. "We are 4 people. 4, David. We have 3 sidearms and 1 working communicator. With a range of 50 kilometers, we have no backup, no extraction plan, no support from command." "I know," David said. "The Dominion garrison has 50 trained soldiers," Grace continued. "They have heavy weapons and armored vehicles and a fortified compound. They have been holding this position for 200 years. They know this ground better than we do." "No," David said again. "So why are we doing this?" David did not answer right away. He thought about the question carefully. He thought about all the logical reasons. They should not be here risking their lives for a species they had just met. "Because they asked for help," he said, finally. "And because no one else is coming." Grace shook her head. "That is not a good enough reason. We could die here, David. We probably will die here. And for what? To give these people a few more years of freedom before the Dominion sends reinforcements." David looked back toward the main cavern, where Brian was teaching a group of Velith warriors how to move in formation. The aliens were clumsy and uncertain, but they were trying. Their crystalline bodies caught the blue light as they practiced, and they looked like living sculptures. Learning to dance, he thought about what Elder had shown him. The centuries of hiding and fear and hopelessness. The children who had grown up never knowing what the sky looked like because it was too dangerous to go above ground. The elders who had died still waiting for help that never came. These people have been waiting 300 years, David said. 300 years of hiding and hoping and watching the sky for someone to come save them. And now we are here. 4 humans with 3 guns and no plan. And they look at us like we are heroes because they believe their prophecies, Grace said. "That does not make us capable of winning this fight." David shook his head. "It is not about the prophecies. It is about what we represent. We are proof that it is possible to survive things that should kill you. We are proof that you can keep fighting even when the odds are against you." Grace was quiet for a moment. Then she spoke softly. "You almost died out there, David. You should have died. The cold should have killed you in minutes, but it did not." "No," Grace admitted. "It did not." David stepped closer to his commanding officer. He spoke with a conviction he did not know he had. "Until that moment, we spent 10,000 years crawling out of ice ages and plagues and wars that should have ended us. We survived because we were too stubborn to know when we were beaten. We kept fighting when every rational calculation said we should give up. That is what makes us human." Grace looked at him with an expression he could not quite read. "And you think we can teach that to them?" she asked. "You think we can make them stubborn enough to weenie?" "Think we have to try," David said. "I think that is what humans do. We try even when it seems hopeless. We fight even when we should lose. We survive even when survival is impossible." He paused and then added, "And sometimes we win." Grace was silent for a long time. The blue light played across her face, and David could see her thinking, weighing the risks against the rewards, calculating the odds of success. Finally, she nodded. "Then we do this," she said. "But we do. It's smart. We do not throw ourselves at that garrison and hope for the best. We find their weaknesses, and we exploit them. We use every advantage we have." "The cold," David said. "That is our biggest advantage. The Korath cannot function in extreme temperatures. Their armor is designed for heat, not cold. If we can draw them out of their compound and keep them fighting in the open, they will freeze. Grace finished, and we will not exactly. Grace turned back toward the main cavern. Brian had finished his formation training and was now working with Rachel to sort through the weapons the Velith had brought. Ancient crystalline blades and spears that looked primitive but were sharp, enough to cut through steel. We need intelligence, Grace said. We need to know everything about that garrison. How many soldiers, where they are positioned, what their patrol routes look like. We need to know their weaknesses better than they know themselves. Elder can help. David said the Velith have been watching the garrison for 200 years. They know more about it than the Dominion soldiers probably know themselves. Then, let us start there, Grace said. She straightened her shoulders, and David saw the soldier she had always been taking control again. We have 3 days to turn these people into an army. 3 days is not much time. David said. No, Grace agreed. But it is what we have. They walked back to the main cavern together, and David felt something shift inside him. For the first time since the crash, he felt like they might actually have a chance. Not a good chance. Not even a reasonable chance. But a chance that was all humans had ever needed. Over the next 3 days, they worked harder than David had ever worked in his life. Brian taught tactics and movement and discipline. Rachel taught first aid and how to treat wounds in the field. Grace planned the attack, with Elder studying maps drawn in the ice and memorizing every detail of the Dominion compound. David taught something harder. He taught the Velith how to not give up. He stood in front of groups of warriors and told them stories about human history, about battles that should have been lost but were won through sheer determination, about soldiers who held positions until the last round was fired and then kept fighting with their bare hands, about ordinary people who faced impossible odds and refused to break. The Velith listened with their glowing blue eyes fixed on him, drinking in every word. They did not fully understand human history, but they understood the feeling behind it, the stubborn refusal to accept defeat, the burning need to keep fighting no matter what. That is what we are, David told them on the night before the attack. We are not the strongest. We are not the fastest. We are not the best armed, but we do not stop, we do not quit, we do not give up. That is how we win. Velith raised their crystalline weapons, and David heard a sound he had never heard before. A war cry that echoed through the ice caves like thunder. Rolling across a frozen sea, they were ready, but the Dominion was ready too. On the morning of the 4th day, Elder came to Grace with news that made David's blood run cold. Dominion sensors had detected something, a human life sign in a place where no human should be. They had sent a patrol to investigate. The element of surprise was slipping away. We attack now, Grace said immediately. We do not wait for them to find us. We hit them before they know what is happening. She looked at her team, at the 3 humans who had followed her into this impossible situation. Brian with his steady hands and calm eyes, Rachel with her medical kit and quiet courage, David with his stubborn heart and the strange connection to these alien people. This is it, she said. Whatever happens today, remember why we are doing this. Remember who we are fighting for. She paused and then added, and remember that humans do not know how to stay dead. Velith army moved out into the frozen dawn. 3,000 warriors, armed with crystal blades and ancient hatred. 4 humans armed with 3 sidearms and 10,000 years of stubbornness. The battle for Kestrel 7 was about to begin. The first shot came from Brian. He had positioned himself on a ridge overlooking the main gate of the Dominion compound. His sidearm was set to maximum power, and his first target was the sensor array mounted on the eastern wall. The shot was perfect. The sensor array exploded in a shower of sparks, and suddenly the Dominion was blind on their eastern flank. The attack began. 3,000 Velith warriors poured out of the ice in waves. They came from hidden tunnels and concealed positions and places the Dominion had never thought to look. They came with weapons raised and war cries echoing across the frozen ground. The Korath soldiers responded with confusion at first. They had not seen combat in decades, and they had never faced an enemy like this. The Veleth moved like ghosts across the ice, flowing around obstacles and striking from unexpected angles, but the Dominion had superior firepower. Plasma rifles cut through the Veleth ranks, and warriors fell by the dozens. Their crystalline bodies shattered on the frozen ground, and the blue blood that flowed from their wounds froze almost instantly. The first wave broke against the compound walls and retreated, leaving hundreds of dead behind. Grace watched from the command position she had established on a nearby ridge. This was the moment she had planned for, the moment when the Veleth would learn whether they could keep fighting after the first defeat. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. The surviving warriors stood in the snow, looking at their fallen comrades, and Grace could feel their resolve wavering. They had never won against Dominion forces. They did not know how to push through the pain and fear. Then David stepped forward. He walked into the open ground between the Veleth lines and the Dominion compound. He did not run. He did not hide. He just walked with his head up and his shoulders back, like he was taking a stroll through a park. The Korath soldiers saw him and opened fire. David dove behind a chunk of ice as plasma bolts screamed past his head. He rolled and came up running, moving from cover to cover in a zigzag pattern that made him almost impossible to hit. He had learned this in basic training, but he had never actually done it under live fire. Before, his heart was pounding and his hands were shaking, but he did not stop. He could not stop. The Veleth were watching, and they needed to see that it was possible to keep moving forward even when death was raining down around you. He reached the compound wall and pressed himself against it. The Korath could not shoot straight down without exposing themselves, so he had a moment to breathe. David looked back at the Veleth army and raised his fist in the air. "Come on," he shouted. "Is this all you have got?" The Veleth charged. This time, they did not stop when they started taking casualties. They flowed around their fallen and kept pushing forward. They reached the wall and began climbing, using their clawed limbs to find purchase on the frozen stone. The Korath tried to push them back, but the Veleth had numbers and momentum and something else now, something they had not had before. They had belief. Brian held his position on the ridge and kept firing. His sidearm was running low on charge, but every shot counted. He took out 3 Korath soldiers who were trying to set up a heavy weapon on the north wall. He took out another who was calling for reinforcements on his communicator. Rachel was in the thick of it. She had refused to stay behind at the command post, insisting that her place was with the wounded. She moved through the chaos with her medical kit, dragging injured Veleth to safety and patching their wounds as best she could. A Korath soldier spotted her and raised his weapon. Rachel did not see him. She was focused on the warrior. She was treating her hands covered in blue blood as she tried to stop the bleeding. Grace saw it happen from 50 meters away. She raised her own sidearm and fired, but she was too far. The shot went wide, and the Korath adjusted his aim. David hit him from behind. He had climbed over the wall and dropped into the compound, and he tackled the Korath soldier before the alien could pull the trigger. They went down hard, and David felt something crack in his shoulder, but he did not let go. He held on and kept hitting until the soldier stopped moving. Rachel looked up and saw David standing over the fallen Korath with blood running down his arm and fire in his eyes. "You are hurt," she said later. David said, "There's no time now." He was right. The battle was reaching its peak. The Veleth had breached the walls in 3 places, and the fighting had become hand-to-hand. Crystalline blades clashed against Korath armor, and the air was filled with screams and war cries and the sound of death. Dominion commander watched from his command center, and he could not believe what he was seeing. His tactical computer kept telling him that the humans should be dead. The mathematics of their survival did not compute. 4 humans had turned a defeated species into an army. 4 humans had inspired 3,000 warriors to keep fighting when they should have run. 4 humans were winning a battle that should have been impossible. He called for reinforcements, but no one answered. The communication array was down. The sensor grid was blind. The compound was falling, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Grace led the final assault herself. She gathered the remaining Velith warriors and pushed toward the command center. The Karath made their last stand, their 50 soldiers reduced to 20 to 10 to 5. The last Dominion soldier fell as the sun began to rise. Grace stood in the command center surrounded by Velith warriors and looked at the Dominion banner that hung on the wall. She reached up and pulled it down and let it fall to the ground. It was over. The Velith had won outside the compound. The survivors were gathering. The cost had been terrible. Hundreds of Velith had died, and hundreds more were wounded. Brian had taken a plasma burn to his leg and could barely walk. Rachel was exhausted from treating the endless stream of casualties. David stood on the wall of the compound and watched the sun come up over Kestrel 7. For the first time in 200 years, the Velith were free to stand in the open air without fear. They were free to look at the sky and know that it belonged to them again. Elder approached him and placed one thumb on his shoulder. The creature did not speak, but David felt its gratitude flowing through their connection. Gratitude and wonder and something that felt like love. Then the Velith did something David had never expected. They began to sing. It started as a low hum from just a few voices, but it spread quickly until thousands of Velith were singing together. Their voices blended into a harmony that seemed to resonate with the ice itself, making the whole world vibrate with sound. Grace limped over to stand beside David. She was bruised and bleeding and more tired than she had ever been in her life, but she was smiling. "What is that?" she asked. David listened to the song and felt its meaning through his connection to Elder. "It is a song of freedom," he said. "They have not sung it since before the occupation. 300 years of silence, and now they are singing again." Grace put her hand on his shoulder, and they stood together watching the sunrise and listening to the song of a people reborn. 6 months later, the story of Kestrel 7 had spread across the galaxy. Other species had heard about the frozen moon, where 4 humans had helped a conquered people win their freedom. They had heard about the Endurers, who carried fire in their blood and refused to die. They had heard about the battle that should have been impossible, and they began to hope on a dozen worlds where the Dominion still ruled. People whispered a new word: Endurers. They wondered if the humans might come to help them. 2. They wondered if hope was finally possible after centuries of despair. David Park, now Ambassador Park, stood on the ice where he had almost frozen to death. Grace stood beside him watching a Velith child play in the snow. The child was one of the first generation to grow up in freedom, to know that the sky was not something to fear. The child ran up to David and tugged at his sleeve. "Ambassador," the child said in halting English that it had been learning. "How did humans learn to be so warm?" David knelt down so he was at eye level with the child. He thought about all the things he could say about evolution and adaptation and biological resilience, but in the end he just smiled and told the truth. "We did not learn it," he said. "We just never figured out how to stop." The child nodded like this made perfect sense and ran off to play again. Grace watched it go and shook her head. "You know, the whole galaxy is watching us now. Every conquered species, every oppressed people, they all think we are some kind of miracle workers." David stood up and looked at the horizon where Velith workers were building new structures on the ruins of the old Dominion compound. "Maybe we are," he said, "or maybe we are just too stubborn to know when something is impossible." Grace laughed. "It is the same thing, is it not?" David thought about that for a moment. Then he nodded. "Yes," he said, "I think it is." In the distance, the Velith were singing again. Their voices rose into the cold air and filled the sky with sound. It was a song of hope and freedom and gratitude, a song for the strange, stubborn creatures who had come from beyond the stars and shown them how to fight. A song for the Endurers, and somewhere out there among the countless worlds of the galaxy, other voices were beginning to join in. The humans were coming, and they did not know how to stay dead.